So what's on your radar, Krystal?
Your job or your life? That is the impossible choice we force working class people to make pretty much every day in this country for no real reason other than cruelty and a desire among our oligarchs to maintain power. That dynamic has maybe never been more clear than it was in the past year during the COVID pandemic. As the white-collar suburbanites hunkered down in their homes for Zoom calls and pajamas, essential workers were forced out onto the front lines, literally risking their lives to keep the society minimally functional and still basically treated in exactly the same shitty way they always are in most cases, with perhaps just an additional layer of saccharine platitudes glossed on from politicians. I remember we covered on Rising how women in Arkansas were leading the charge to demand basic rights at Tyson's poultry processing plants, where they were at high risk in brutal, low-paying jobs. The company responded to the movement with some modest concessions like offering disability pay at 60% if a worker contracted the virus and promising not to fire workers who missed their shifts due to contracting coronavirus. I want you to think about that one for a second. Workers had to organize and protest just to make sure that if they did get sick with COVID, they wouldn't get fired for not coming into work and infecting everyone else. Gotta keep those chicken nuggets stocked on the shelves after all, and if a few workers die in the process, so be it. But a new story from the Washington Post reveals just how commonplace the trade-off between jobs and health or even life are for non-college educated workers. Residents in St. James Parish, Louisiana are fighting a proposed plastics plant that wants to locate in their community. They rightly fear the toxins that could cause cancer and destroy their health. Now, this part of Louisiana, it's already known as Cancer Alley because of the high rates of cancer caused, we think, by industrial pollutants and chemical makers that have already polluted that area. According to the Washington Post, experts predict that this one plastic maker alone could double the cancer rate for nearby residents. State law would allow it to emit more than 800 tons a year of toxic chemicals, nearly 6,500 tons of pollutants known to cause respiratory ailments, and more than 13.6 million tons of greenhouse gases annually. This is in an area that is overwhelmingly poor and overwhelmingly black. 91% of the parish's residents are black, 61% of the children live in poverty. That's no accident, of course. Try putting a plant like this in a wealthy white enclave, say McLean, Virginia, and see what happens then. They've got the money and the influence to afford to keep this toxic catastrophe out of their backyards, and they've got cushy job prospects that don't include risking death in a plastics factory. Because aside from the poor black residents of Cancer Alley having no political power, there's another reason why they might not block a plant like this setting up in their town. A local activist who lives just 2 miles from the site explained, "People in St. James don't speak up, not when jobs are on the line." So this plant is supposed to come with 8,000 temporary and 1,200 permanent jobs, and so there it is again. What do you pick? Do you take your chances with cancer so that you might earn a living? Or do you block it and watch your kids go to bed at night hungry? Well, what do? Abandoned by society, these folks have little other choice. The same dynamic plays out in the coal fields of Appalachia. West Virginia is often wildly misrepresented, totally demonized by the media. It is not, in fact, a state full of backwards hillbillies just obsessed with mining coal. Environmental damage be damned. In fact, coal mining is one of the most brutal and dangerous jobs available. It has horrific health consequences. Miners have been contracting black lung at younger and younger ages, a disease that literally suffocates you to death. But if you've got a high school diploma and you live in southern West Virginia, it is damn near the only job you can get that will get you any semblance of a middle-class life. Be able to get a place of your own, raise a family, maybe get a fishing boat, a nice truck. And big news yesterday, though, the United Mine Workers of America, they are rejecting this false choice between environmental protections, health, and jobs, and embracing a shift towards union green jobs, provided that it comes with actual job security for their people. In other words, the nation's largest union of miners just came out in favor of a just transition, a core tenet of the Green New Deal. In an interview, the union's president, Krystal Ball, said that there needs to be a tremendous investment here. We always end up dealing with climate change, closing down coal mines. We never get to the second piece of it. The second piece, of course, being jobs. Now, I would argue we haven't done nearly enough to deal with climate change, and coal is declining for a lot of market reasons as well that don't have that much to do with climate policy. But Krystal Ball is spot on that it is completely unacceptable for the livelihoods of miners to be casually sacrificed with no actual plan to replace them. Why should the cost of combating climate change fall most heavily on the working class when it's the 1% and big corporations who are overwhelmingly the drivers of that crisis? He exposes the lie here. There is no inherent reason that we have to force workers into this Faustian bargain, pushing these horrific trade-offs down for the working class and the working poor to shoulder and to deal with. Whether it is miners or poultry workers or the folks in Louisiana deciding whether to take their chances with cancer or with poverty, we could protect these citizens. We could cherish their health, guarantee them a livelihood. This isn't some utopian dream either. Instead of forcing the poor to trade their lives for their livelihoods, we could instead force the rich to trade in some of their vast wealth. You might even call it a New Deal. And Emily, this news about the mine workers, it went a little bit under the radar, but this is a dramatic shift. And it was announced alongside Joe Manchin, something that they've been working together in tandem. You don't hear a lot of positive mentions of Joe Manchin from me on this show, although I will say he just signed out of the PRO Act, the pro-union legislation, so good on him for that. This is really a dramatic shift. And I think part of what was appealing about the Green New Deal, even though it has been really demonized in a lot of ways, is that it bundled together this idea of a just transition with fighting climate change. So for the first time, the real innovation here was we're not just focused on this side of it. We actually want to bring people along versus what neoliberals in the Democratic Party have been doing for decades of saying, oh, we're going to give you job training. Oh, don't worry about it. Or the cold calculus of like, oh, it's creative destruction, so just deal with it. And maybe we'll give you some housing vouchers so you can move to some other part of the country. This actually responds to people's needs in real time and makes sure that the working class of this country are not the ones bearing the costs and the burden of moving away from this old economy.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that creative destruction is not just a line that I think is too flippantly used on the right. It's also one that's too flippantly used in the sort of neoliberal center, just period.
They just say it quietly. Like the right will just say it out loud. They just actually think it and then, pretend they're going to do some job training.
I was just going to say, yes. Or they don't say it at all and they substitute, when they say job training, what they really mean at the end of the day is creative destruction. And from my perspective, the sad thing is that it's because they're wildly unacquainted with these communities that they're seeking to rule, and they don't actually understand the reality on the ground. Like West Virginia is such a good example that when you zoom into what really happens, it's middle-class life. The way to have a middle-class life that everybody sees in the media and on television, as we understand it culturally in this country, that if you have a high school diploma, that's the route, and that's a really important part to understand about these communities. And I think that's why, sometimes the federalist system works and you have people like Joe Manchin who are responsive to the needs of their communities, because the reality, I think, is really starting to set in of this transition. And market forces, like you mentioned, market forces are inducing a shift from coal anyway. And so as that reality starts to grip some of these communities, I think we are seeing just naturally politicians be more responsive to that.
I lived in this town in Ohio called East Liverpool that used to be, it's suffered from deindustrialization like most of the country has. Used to be a place that was kind of like a center for the region. People would come there Christmas shopping. They had the pottery industry there with their claim to fame. So they made all these plates and dishes. Fiesta ware, if you guys know that, is made just across the river now in Newell, West Virginia. That all started to go away like 50s and 60s. Then there was a steel mill in the next town over, good union jobs. Again, you're not going to be living high on the hog. You'll be able to get a house, have a family. If your wife doesn't want to work, she doesn't have to work. That sort of like classic middle class stability sense. That, of course, went away in the 80s as the steel industry domestically here collapsed. And so now the town has shifted dramatically to the right. I actually just saw these stats from Cook Political. They do their ratings of what's the partisan voting index in every congressional district in the country. And they put out a list of which districts in the country have moved the fastest to the right.
Yeah.
That town and the district that it resides in is the fastest moving to the right town in the entire country. Because, look, the Republicans haven't actually delivered anything for people in this town. In fact, they've lined up with the corporations at twice as hard as the Democrats. But I think there's a sense that the Democrats at least led me to believe that they were going to be different. They came into these towns and said, we're going to get your jobs back. We're going to make sure to support you. And then they turn around and they do something like NAFTA, or they do TPP, or they say job training, and it never actually amounts to any sort of job that I can get in my region. The interesting thing to me is, with the Green New Deal and the new framing around we're going to pair jobs with climate change, it actually, even though it's been pushed out by the left of the party, people like AOC, who, by the way, just reintroduced it this week, it actually put the jobs at the center in a way that could be really appealing to moderates, but instead it's been painted as this sort of like fringe thing. So it's interesting to me to see the coal miners union come out and sort of embrace the core tenet of the Green New Deal, even as they would never touch the toxic label of the Green New Deal.
Well, so this is what's very interesting, is that I don't think it's going to be appealing to moderates. It'll actually, I think, be appealing to people like Marco Rubio and people like Ted Cruz, as crazy as it sounds, who now pay a lot of lip service to union workers and say the Republican Party is now the party of the working class. They roll out that line constantly, right?
Yeah.
And at some point, if there are policies, I mean, Republicans have been getting behind like surprisingly non-conservative or non-orthodox conservative policies that are sort of like innovative ideas. None of them have really become mainstream or passed, but there are people who are mainstream, like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, who are working on these ideas. This is something that I think it's not a matter of getting Joe Manchin or Susan Collins behind. I actually think to look to the right flank is probably even more productive in terms of these conversations, because I'm telling you, I think there is an appetite to start talking about this on the right.
I wish you were right. I don't think so, though. I mean, I see the way they vote. Yeah, Marco Rubio puts on a thing that's like, man, this one limited instance in Alabama, I support the union workers. But in general, I think unions are terrible. They're still, draw a hard line against raising corporate tax rates whatsoever. Didn't back the relief bill, which is broadly I'll believe it when I see it. I think that they've sort of realized that all they have to do is signal the right way in the culture wars. That lets them off the hook from having to do anything policy-wise. But I hope that you're right. The last thing that I'll note about that town that I used to live in, East Liverpool, is, of course, they have a toxic waste incinerator that they put in next to an elementary school.
Oh, good, yeah.
In the town.
Right where it belongs.
Because you got people who are so desperate, it's like, well, if it's going to create a few jobs, I guess we'll let the toxic waste incinerator into the town because they just have very little other choice.
No, I think you're right. There's a lot of signaling going on, but one thing we didn't even get to is the influence of China, which makes this more appealing, I think, to the right as well. Where is global pollution coming from? It's coming from China in large part, in these corporations that you talk about not passing down a lot of their profits to people who are on the front lines, especially during COVID, where there's a harsh divide. Who is shouldering the burden of the climate change? Working people. And hello, China is doing a lot of that, and these corporations are very cozy with China.
Very true. All right, Emily, looking forward to what's on your mind. That's next.